president, the king's eye was noticeably bloodshot. A Buckingham Palace spokesperson explained that there is no cause for alarm and that it was caused by a burst blood vessel in his right eye, which appeared overnight. They added that it is unrelated to the monarch's ongoing cancer treatment. The pomp and pageantry will include a formal welcome at the Royal Dais in Datchet Road, Windsor, and a royal salute will be fired in Home Park and the Tower of London. The King, the Queen, the Waleses and Mr. and Mrs. Macron will then take a carriage procession through the Berkshire town and along part of the Lawn Walk which leads to the castle. A ceremonial welcome will be staged in the castle's quadrangle with Camilla, William, Kate and Mrs. Macron watching as the King and Mr. Macron inspect the guard of honour. Lunch will be hosted in the state dining room, after which the President and his wife, the King and Queen and members of the royal family will view a special exhibition of items relating to France from the royal collection in the Green Drawing Room. Mr. and Mrs. Macron will also travel to London on Tuesday afternoon to see the grave of the unknown warrior at Westminster Abbey, visit the Palace of Westminster where the French leader will address parliamentarians in the Royal Gallery, and meet opposition leaders at Lancaster House. This evening, the King will host a glittering state banquet at Windsor Castle's St. George's Hall, where both Charles and Macron will deliver speeches to invited guests. Kensington Palace has yet to confirm whether or not the princess will attend the banquet. Wednesday will see the President and Mrs. Macron join Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer and Lady Starmer for lunch at Downing Street, ahead of a UK-France summit at No. 10 on Thursday. In the soft summer air of Kensington Palace, no one expected the monarchy's future to be rewritten in a single breath. But that's exactly what happened. The day began as so many others had, with polished photographers adjusting lenses, reporters chattering about minor details, and guests arriving in their best attire, ready for another predictable royal engagement. The crowd settled in anticipation of charming smiles from Princess Charlotte, a graceful wave from Prince George, and perhaps a poignant comment or two from Prince William before everyone returned to their lives with little more than a pleasant memory. But beneath the surface of that ordinary charity event, something extraordinary was about to unfold. All eyes turned toward the familiar figure of Prince William as he approached the podium, his tall frame exuding a quiet resolve that felt markedly different from his usual warm presence. His fiery demeanour caught even seasoned royal correspondents off guard. At his side, Catherine stood with her signature serenity, one hand resting gently on Charlotte's shoulder as though offering silent encouragement. The children remained close, their composed faces belying their age. William's gaze swept over the expectant crowd, and with a steady voice he invoked the vision and unshakable legacy of Queen Elizabeth II, the very essence of the monarchy she had safeguarded for decades. He spoke of her dedication, her sense of duty, and her dreams for the institution's future. But then the air shifted, every ear strained as William leaned forward and declared with a force that reverberated through the historic hall that his family, particularly Charlotte, would assume greater responsibilities in shaping the next era of the monarchy. In that instant, centuries of unspoken tradition cracked beneath his words. Gasps rippled through the audience. Palace officials exchanged startled glances, their composure faltering for just a moment as the weight of the announcement sank in. And still no response came from King Charles, no word from Queen Camilla, just silence deep and deliberate, as though even they hadn't foreseen the storm gathering at Kensington that day. But as the applause faded, whispers began to swirl, whispers of power shifting behind the palace walls. While William's words electrified the crowd, the deafening silence from Charles and Camilla spoke volumes. Their absence that day became more than just a detail. It became the story itself. As William's declaration reverberated across the palace grounds and into the headlines around the world, there was no sight of the king, not even a statement. And though the cameras panned expectantly toward any sign of Camilla, she too was nowhere to be seen. For a royal family built on the symbolism of unity and presence, their silence was more than conspicuous. It was damning. In that void, questions began to multiply. Whispers, faint at first, gained strength with each passing hour. Why had the monarch chosen not to appear? Why had Camilla kept her distance at such a pivotal moment? What did their absence mean for the future of the crown? Behind the scenes, palace aides scrambled to offer explanations, but none of them sounded convincing. Some dismissed it as an oversight. Others suggested a scheduling conflict. But those who watched closely understood there was something far more significant at play. Reports trickled out of Buckingham that Charles had been growing increasingly withdrawn in the weeks before William's announcement. He had cancelled appearances with little warning, skipped meetings he himself had called, and quietly retreated from public view. Those who encountered him behind closed doors described him as tired, irritable, and at times strangely detached, as though the crown he had waited his entire life to wear was already weighing too heavily on him. Camilla's absence only deepened the mystery. She, who had fought for decades to solidify her place within the royal family, was also missing from the scene where the monarchy's next chapter was being written. Some speculated she was too furious to appear alongside William and Catherine. Others suggested she simply could not bring herself to watch Charlotte elevated at the expense of her own influence. Either way, her silence was impossible to ignore. The woman who had so often stood at Charles's side was now nowhere to be found, as though deliberately stepping back or being pushed aside. As the days passed, the whispers about Charles began to take on a darker tone. Insiders spoke of his growing isolation within the palace, of long stretches spent alone, of aides being dismissed or ignored. His public schedule, once packed with ceremonial duties and engagements, grew thinner. Aides insisted to the press that the king was simply taking time to recuperate for a grueling first year on the throne. They called it exhaustion, a perfectly acceptable word that disguised the deeper truth that the king was struggling not only with his health, but with his own relevance. Behind the heavy doors of royal chambers, tension rose. Reports began to emerge of heated arguments between Charles and his advisers over William's rising prominence. Some said the king felt undermined, blindsided by the announcement that his granddaughter would take on official duties before he had even completed his first full year as sovereign. Others claimed that he railed against what he saw as a deliberate effort to sideline him, a quiet rebellion cloaked in charm and smiles. But the more he fought to assert himself, the more the public's attention drifted toward William, Catherine, and their children. Then, in the midst of this turmoil, whispers of abdication began to surface in the tabloid. Subtle at first, dismissed by loyalists as speculative nonsense, but soon the whispers found their way into more serious commentary. Could Charles, under the strain of age and waning support, choose to step aside? Could William's stunning declaration have been the opening move in a carefully orchestrated transition? Such questions no longer seemed far-fetched, and as Charles retreated, another figure emerged from the shadows. Not William, but Catherine. Behind William's defiance stood a strategist. No one suspected of Catherine orchestrating a royal revolution. While the world's attention fixated on William's fiery words and Charlotte's remarkable composure, few noticed the quiet force guiding it all from the shadows. For years, Catherine had studied the palace's hidden rhythms, its fractures, and its unwritten rules. Moving through its halls, not as a mere wife of the air, but as a master observer where others saw her serene smile and elegant silence, She was in fact taking notes, learning the subtle power plays, watching where alliances formed, and where they crumbled, understanding which traditions held sway, and which could be bent. Slowly, carefully, she built her strategy, knowing that someday the moment to act would come. The public had long adored her, but Catherine's charm was not superficial. She did not win hearts with theatrics or empty gestures, but through sincerity so rare it disarmed even her fiercest critics. Every visit she made, every speech she gave, every quiet word exchanged with a nervous child or weary parent built a foundation of trust that became unshakable. While Camilla laboured for decades to repair her image, Catherine's reputation was forged effortlessly not because she sought approval, but because she embodied it. People did not merely admire her, they believed her. And that belief would become the greatest weapon in the battle, quietly unfolding within the palace walls. It was said, quietly at first, and then more confidently, that Catherine had not simply supported William's bold move. She had shaped it. Reports emerged of her slipping into secret meetings with senior advisers, not just by his side, but at his direction, offering counsel and insight in a tone that surprised those who underestimated her. She was said to have spoken plainly to Commonwealth representatives and foreign dignitaries, laying out her vision for a monarchy that could adapt without surrendering its dignity. These conversations, once dismissed as informal, began to ripple outward, turning into real conversations about the future. Months before William's announcement stunned the world, Catherine had already taken steps to ensure it would succeed. She commissioned private polling to measure public sentiment toward Charlotte's elevation, a move that revealed staggering levels of support. These figures, when shared quietly among advisers and allies, created the confidence to push forward, even as opposition murmured in the corners of the palace. Catherine knew that no royal decision could withstand a public backlash, and she made certain that there wouldn't be one. Every detail of William's declaration carried her fingerprints. His phrasing, his timing, even the symbolism of Charlotte stepping forward rather than being summoned are all shaped by Catherine's subtle influence. It was no accident that the announcement came on the heels of weeks of Charles's absence and Camilla's retreat. Catherine waited until the air was thick with unease, the old guard on their heels, the public hungry for strength and certainty. Then, and only then, did she unleash the statement that rewrote the monarchy's future. Yet, her genius lay not just in strategy, but in her ability to hold the family together during the storm that followed. As William and Charles clashed behind closed doors, as Camilla raged, and advisers scrambled to adjust, Catherine remained the quiet centre of it all, the moral and emotional anchor, keeping them from breaking apart completely. Her presence reassured the public that while a revolution was underway, the heart of the family remained whole. But if Catherine was the architect, the rising star she unveiled was destined to steal the world's heart. She was just a child. Yet, when Charlotte stepped forward, she carried centuries of monarchy on her shoulders. The moment her small yet unwavering figure emerged alongside William and Catherine, the air seemed to shift. A hush fell over the crowd, a silence that was not born of disbelief, but of awe. Her eyes met the sea of faces before her with a confidence that no one, not even the most seasoned observers of royal affairs, had expected. It was the kind of presence that didn't just command attention, it demanded it. In a single breath, Charlotte reminded everyone that greatness was not bound by age, and leadership could live in even the youngest among them. Her poised demeanour left the crowd and press momentarily stunned. Whispers rippled through the audience, then swelled into a murmur of admiration that seemed to echo far beyond the palace grounds. Commentators scrambled to capture the significance of the scene in words, but most could only marvel at what was unfolding before them. This wasn't just a daughter of the future king standing at his side. This was a quiet yet unmistakable defiance of the centuries-old idea that the monarchy was a man's domain. In that single step forward, Charlotte became a bridge connecting the quiet strength of Queen Elizabeth, the luminous spirit of Princess Diana, and her own fierce individuality into one symbolic act. Almost instantly, the world seemed to agree. Within hours, photographs of Charlotte smiling with calm determination began to flood global headlines and dominate social media feeds. In every shot, her expression radiated something rare, the kind of inner strength that can't be rehearsed or taught. Millions shared her image, calling her the face of the monarchy's next chapter. Editorials hailed her as a symbol of resilience, hope, and modernity. Her name trended across continents, inspiring admiration from those who had long dismissed the royal family as relics of a bygone era. Speculation began to swirl immediately. Could Charlotte one day eclipse even her brother George in influence? Could she, despite her place in the line of succession, become the monarch the people truly longed for? Experts argued and palace insiders whispered. Some pointed to her natural composure as evidence of a potential shift in priorities behind the scenes, a subtle but deliberate effort to place her at the heart of the monarchy's future, regardless of formal titles. For the first time in generations, the question of succession felt less certain and far more intriguing. William, ever the careful tactician, framed her debut not as a ceremonial gesture, but as the beginning of something deliberate. His words that day underscored her role not merely as a figure to be admired, but as an active participant in shaping the future of the crown. He spoke of service of duty, of a vision that embraced every member of the family, male or female, as equal bearers of responsibility. And in doing so, he signalled that this was not just about Charlotte stepping forward, but about dismantling the old assumptions and embracing a more inclusive monarchy. That day marked more than just a milestone for Charlotte. It marked a turning point for the institution itself, the dawn of a vision no longer bound by rigid tradition, but energized by modernity and inclusiveness. And in her quiet strength, the public found the promise of something new. But while the world cheered, one woman saw her own power slipping away, and she would not go quietly. As the cameras flashed on Charlotte, Camilla erupted in fury behind closed doors, calling it madness. To the public, the moment belonged to a young girl stepping confidently into history. But in the privacy of the royal apartments, another drama was unfolding, one far darker and more personal. For Camilla, Charlotte's rise was not a charming symbol of progress. It was an existential threat. The years she had spent clawing her way toward legitimacy now felt suddenly fragile, as though they could be swept away by the smile of a child, and the quiet brilliance of a mother who had outplayed her at every turn. The applause outside only deepened the silence inside. And that silence for Camilla was unbearable. She wasted no time in confronting Charles. Late that same evening, she demanded a statement from the king, a public reaffirmation of her role and her place within the hierarchy. Her voice, usually measured and controlled, cracked with anger as she accused him of standing by while his son dismantled everything they had fought to build. But Charles, already weary and worn by weeks of strain, simply shook his head. He told her the time to fight had passed, that the tide had turned, and that nothing he said would stop what was already in motion. His refusal to act felt to Camilla like a betrayal, but more than that, it felt like surrender. Her fury only grew in the days that followed. Palace insiders spoke of her pacing the corridors at night, doors slamming hard enough to rattle the gilded frames on the walls. She ran to aides, issuing demands that no one fulfilled. Staff who once scrambled to meet her wishes now avoided her gaze, unsure if she still wielded the authority she believed she did. Every whispered conversation in the halls seemed to sharpen her sense of isolation, and she came to suspect even her allies of plotting against her. What she could not ignore, however, was how thoroughly she had been eclipsed. Catherine, once derided in whispers as too polished, too quiet, now stood as the embodiment of everything. Camilla was not beloved, trusted, and untouchable. No matter how hard Camilla tried, she could not summon the same kind of affection from the public. She had spent decades fighting to reshape her image, but in a single afternoon, Catherine and Charlotte had stolen what she had bled for. Worse still, the old scandals, the ones she thought she had finally buried, began to creep back into the headlines. Columnists drew unflattering comparisons, revisiting the bitterness of her past and questioning the cost of her presence beside the king. Each article chipped away at the fragile dignity she had built for herself, and each headline reminded her that history was not on her side. Desperate to salvage what she could, Camilla began to rally others within the palace who felt equally threatened by the changing winds. She reached out to members of the old guard, those who still believed in the strict traditions that William and Catherine seemed eager to dismantle. It was an uneasy alliance bound more by fear than by loyalty. Together, they whispered strategies in quiet corners, vowing to slow the momentum of the young royals before it swept them away entirely. But even Camilla's desperate maneuvers couldn't halt the tide already sweeping through the palace corridors. While the royal walls trembled, the world beyond chose its champions, and they were younger crowns. In the days that followed Charlotte's debut, the streets, screens, and newspapers told a story that left little doubt about where public sentiment lay. Across the globe, William, Catherine, and their children were celebrated not merely as the present face of the monarchy, but as its undeniable future. Every image of Charlotte standing firm beside her father became a symbol. Every soft smile from Catherine, a quiet confirmation that the torch had already been passed in the hearts of the people. The press, once divided in its loyalties, now leaned decisively toward Kensington Palace. Columns praised the family's grace under pressure, their courage to embrace change, and their ability to inspire trust in an institution so often criticized for being out of touch. Foreign dignitaries, too, seemed to recognize the shift, where once they addressed their letters and their hopes to Clarence House, they now reached directly to Kensington. Meetings were quietly requested not with Charles, but with William. Invitations flowed not toward Camilla, but toward Catherine. Even ambassadors, who had previously clung to rigid protocol, began to break from tradition, aligning themselves with the rising energy radiating from the younger royals. One by one, as if by instinct, the world began to acknowledge a new centre of power. Public opinion polls painted the same picture, only more starkly. Numbers that had once hovered respectfully in Charles's favour collapsed almost overnight. William's approval ratings surged to unprecedented heights. Catherine was hailed as the most admired royal figure of her generation. Her quiet determination now seen as a beacon of stability and compassion. And Charlotte, though still so young, captured hearts with the promise she represented. For the first time in decades, the monarchy's relevance seemed secured not through history or ceremony, but through genuine affection and admiration. Meanwhile, Charles and Camilla found themselves painted by the media in increasingly unflattering light. Articles described them as distant, aloof, and clinging to an era long past. Editorial cartoons depicted them as ghosts haunting corridors that no longer belonged to them. While their son and his family strode confidently toward the future, Camilla, already bruised by old scandals and recent snubs, felt the sting of headlines that called her influence fading and her presence inconvenient. Charles, once seen as the patient heir who would modernize the throne, now appeared hesitant, his authority eclipsed by the charisma of his son and daughter-in-law. The headlines were relentless. Charlotte, the monarchy's future. They read, "A new era begins at Kensington." Magazines featured glowing profiles of the young princess and her poised parents. While the king and queen consort were increasingly relegated to the margins of coverage, to some it seemed cruel, to others inevitable, the brutal clarity of public opinion choosing its favourites. And William and Catherine, ever watchful, capitalized on this momentum with precision. Their engagements were carefully chosen to reinforce their vision. Visits to children's hospitals, appearances at environmental summits, speeches that spoke not of duty alone, but of shared hope. Every step seemed calculated, yet never contrived, as though they understood instinctively that trust, once given, must be nurtured. Yet behind the smiles and applause, more than just popularity was at stake. A secret inheritance was quietly revealed. Buried in whispers and hidden letters lay Queen Elizabeth's true vision for her crown, and it didn't centre on Camilla. In the weeks after William's seismic announcement, an even deeper story began to surface, one that cast everything that had unfolded in a chilling new light. Palace insiders, emboldened by the shifting power dynamics, quietly spoke of private letters written by the late Queen before her death. Letters addressed not only to Charles, but also to William and Catherine. Their existence had long been rumoured, dismissed by some as fantasy, but now they began to feel like the missing piece of a carefully orchestrated plan. Those closest to her claimed that Elizabeth had always seen the crown not simply as an inheritance, but as a living trust, something to be preserved, strengthened, and passed on in its finest form. And in her final months, she reportedly put that vision to paper. The letters, though still sealed to the public, were said to reveal her belief that the monarchy's future lay not with Charles and Camilla, but with the younger generation who embodied the adaptability and compassion the institution so desperately needed. Some even claimed the letters went further, naming Charlotte herself as a symbol of renewal, a future leader who would carry both the grace of Elizabeth and the spirit of Diana into a new era. Whether or not Charlotte's name appeared explicitly, the mere suggestion that the Queen foresaw her rising so prominently sent shock waves through the palace. It offered not just a justification, but a mandate for William's bold move, and exposed just how precarious Camilla's position had always been. For William, the revelation was transformative. According to those who knew him best, it was the quiet knowledge of his grandmother's blessing that gave him the courage to defy both tradition and his father. The words in those letters reportedly reminded him that service to the monarchy meant more than obeying the man who wore the crown. It meant protecting the institution itself, even if it meant confronting the king. Catherine too drew strength from what Elizabeth had left behind. In the silence of their private moments, the couple reportedly returned again and again to her words, finding in them not just guidance but permission to act. For Camilla, however, the existence of these letters was a final, unspoken verdict. They hung in the air like a quiet condemnation, making her protests seem petty and her fury hollow. Whatever legitimacy she believed she had earned was now overshadowed by the weight of the Queen's foresight, a vision that had not included her as a central figure in the future. Even Charles, some claimed, grew subdued after reading them, as though recognizing at last that his mother's wisdom might have anticipated the public's will better than he ever could. And so, with Elizabeth's blessing in their hearts, William and Catherine moved boldly, but Charles still clung to what little power remained. Cornered and diminished, Charles made one final attempt to reclaim his crown's authority and failed spectacularly. In the wake of William and Catherine's decisive rise, with Charlotte hailed as the monarchy's bright future and the Queen's hidden wishes now revealed, Charles could no longer ignore the shifting tide. But he was not yet ready to surrender. In a last desperate maneuver to prove his relevance, he proposed an ambitious Commonwealth tour, a grand journey meant to remind the world and himself who still sat on the throne. It was to be a show of power, a reaffirmation of his rightful place at the centre of the monarchy, and a message to William that the king was not yet ready to fade into the shadows. At first, the idea drew polite approval from his closest advisers, but behind closed doors, whispers of doubt grew louder. The political landscape was fraught with some member states openly questioning their ties to the crown. Logistical challenges piled up with security concerns and diplomatic tensions, making every stop on the itinerary more precarious. Even senior officials quietly cautioned Charles that the tour, rather than uniting his subjects, might expose just how tenuous his hold had become. Yet he pressed on, ignoring the warnings, convinced this spectacle could restore what had been lost. But as the preparations unravelled, so too did Charles himself. Those around him began to see cracks in his composure that could no longer be explained away by exhaustion alone. He became increasingly short-tempered, lashing out at aides who questioned the feasibility of the trip. Long stretches of indecision were punctuated by sudden outbursts, and even his most loyal advisers began to worry. The quiet confidence that had once defined him seemed to have been replaced by a brittle desperation, a need to claw back, a sense of control that was slipping further with each passing day. Palace insiders began to shift their allegiances in subtle but unmistakable ways. Briefings once sent to Clarence House began arriving at Kensington instead. Invitations to high-profile events carried William and Catherine's names at the top, with Charles and Camilla almost as an afterthought. Journalists who once wrote cautiously respectful pieces about the king now turned their attention almost exclusively to the younger royals, whose charm and vision had captivated the public. The authority Charles had once commanded by virtue of his position was now openly challenged within his own family, and no amount of protocol could disguise it. Even Camilla, once his fiercest defender, found herself powerless to stem the tide. She attempted to rally the old guard once more, urging staff and courtiers to remember who wore the crown. But her efforts fell flat, her argument sounding hollow against the roar of public adoration for William, Catherine, and Charlotte. The staff she once commanded now responded to her with forced smiles and polite indifference, their loyalties quietly but clearly transferred. And so, as the sun set on Charles's reign, a new dawn broke, carried on the shoulders of his grandchildren.